Evelyn didn't remember when her days had started to blur together. They were a collage of quiet mornings, solitary meals, and evenings spent with the hum of a television filling the silence of her modest home. It wasn't an unhappy life, but it was one defined by routine, a life where each day felt much like the last. At 53, she had grown accustomed to it, finding small comforts in the predictability of her existence. On Tuesday mornings, she went to the grocery store, always at the same time, when the aisles were calm, and she could move through them unhurried. She enjoyed these trips, though she wouldn't have called them exciting. They were practical, necessary, and in their own way, comforting. It was on one of these Tuesdays in the produce section that she noticed him. At first, it was just a passing glance, a young man with tousled brown hair crouched by a display of oranges. He seemed out of place in her world, dressed in a way that suggested an easy confidence, his movements unhurried yet purposeful. She might not have thought twice about him if it hadn't been for the way he looked up at her, offering a smile as he rose to his feet. "Excuse me," he said, stepping aside to make room for her. The warmth in his voice caught her off guard. She muttered a polite "thank you" and moved past him, feeling strangely self-conscious under his gaze. Evelyn continued through the aisles, dismissing the encounter as unremarkable. But fate seemed to have other plans. At the end of the dairy section, she found herself face to face with him again. This time he was examining a carton of milk, squinting at the label as though trying to solve a puzzle. "Do you know if this is the kind without lactose?" he asked, holding up the carton. Caught off guard, Evelyn blinked. "I think it is," she said, pointing to the small print on the label. He smiled, his eyes lighting up with a boyish charm that made her heart flutter. "Thanks. You'd think they'd make that easier to spot." She chuckled softly, her hand tightening around the handle of her shopping cart. "It does feel like they make it harder on purpose." They spoke for only a moment longer, but when he walked away, Evelyn felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as though something rare and fleeting had slipped through her fingers. The rest of her shopping trip passed in a haze. She told herself not to dwell on the encounter, but she couldn't help glancing toward the registers as she loaded her groceries onto the conveyor belt. There he was again, 2 lanes over, chatting easily with the cashier. She caught herself staring and quickly looked away, feeling foolish. That night, as she unpacked her groceries in the quiet of her kitchen, Evelyn thought about the stranger with the warm smile and easy laugh. She told herself it was nothing, just a pleasant interaction in an otherwise mundane day. But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like that, as though she were more than just another face in the crowd. And for the first time in years, Evelyn found herself wondering what it might feel like to be seen again the next Tuesday. Evelyn found herself lingering longer than usual in the produce section. She told herself she was simply taking her time, inspecting each item carefully, but a small, treacherous part of her hoped she might see him again. She scolded herself for the thought. After all, what were the chances? But then she saw him. He was near the avocados this time, inspecting one with the same thoughtful expression she remembered. Her heart leapt, and she hesitated, torn between slipping away unnoticed or walking past him. Before she could decide, he looked up and saw her. His face brightened with recognition, and he smiled. "Hey, lactose lady," he called out, the nickname making her laugh despite herself. She approached, feeling both awkward and strangely exhilarated. "That's a new one," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He held up an avocado. "Any tips on picking a good one? Or am I on my own here?" Evelyn smiled and gently took the avocado from his hand, pressing it lightly near the stem. "You want one that gives just a little when you press here. Too firm and it's not ripe. Too soft, and it's probably past its prime." He watched her with an earnestness that made her feel like an expert rather than someone who had merely read an article online. "You're a lifesaver," he said. "I'm Sam, by the way." "Evelyn," she replied, feeling her cheeks flush. They stood there for a moment, the hum of the store fading into the background. Then he asked, "Do you shop here every week?" His question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then nodded. "Tuesdays, usually." "Good to know," he said with a grin, grabbing an avocado and dropping it into his basket. Over the next few weeks, their chance encounters became less accidental and more like quiet rituals. They would bump into each other by the cereal or in the baking aisle, exchanging easy banter about the absurdity of grocery prices or the best ways to cook vegetables. Evelyn learned that Sam was 29 and worked as a graphic designer. He'd recently moved to town and was still adjusting to the slower pace of life here compared to the bustling city he'd left behind. "I grew up in a house where cooking was more of a survival skill than an art," he admitted one day, holding up a jar of pasta sauce. "I'm still figuring it out." Evelyn laughed. "You're not alone. My first attempts at cooking for myself were disasters. My late husband used to tease me about the smoke alarm doubling as a timer." Sam's expression softened. "Your husband passed away?" "Yes," she said quietly. "It was years ago now, but yes." He didn't press her for details, which she appreciated. Instead, he simply said, "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." His sincerity touched her in a way she hadn't expected. Over time, their conversations deepened, moving beyond small talk to stories about their lives. Evelyn found herself looking forward to their exchanges, her once ordinary grocery trips now imbued with a sense of anticipation. One afternoon, as they stood in the coffee aisle, Sam said, "You know, you're the first real friend I've made since moving here." The word friend stirred something bittersweet in Evelyn. It felt safe, appropriate, but it also reminded her of the boundaries she had tried to maintain. Still, she couldn't deny the warmth his words brought. "You make Tuesdays a lot more interesting," she said with a smile. He grinned, and in that moment, Evelyn felt a spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a quiet, unexpected joy. It was late one evening, long after her grocery bags had been unpacked and the house had settled into its familiar silence. Evelyn sat by the window with a cup of tea, the events of the day replaying in her mind. Her conversations with Sam had become the highlight of her week, a brightness that felt almost too good to be true. Tonight, she found herself smiling, thinking of his playful grin and the way he had laughed when she mispronounced the name of an exotic spice. He had corrected her gently, not with the superiority of someone younger, but with genuine warmth. As the tea cooled in her hands, a sudden thought struck her, sharp and unrelenting. "I miss him when he's not here." The realization unraveled her composure. She set the mug down and leaned back, her pulse quickening. What was this feeling? Friendship? Yes, but also something deeper, something that made her stomach flutter and her heart ache all at once. For years, she had convinced herself that the part of her capable of such emotions had gone dormant, perhaps forever. Losing her husband had left a void so profound she had resigned herself to its permanence. Love, she thought, was for the young or for those willing to take risks she no longer felt brave enough to face. And yet here it was, this stirring of something unnameable, ignited by a man decades her junior who had somehow managed to dismantle the walls she had built. She stood abruptly, pacing the room as the implication sank in. "This is absurd," she muttered to herself. "I'm 53 years old. He's not even 30. The mirror above the fireplace caught her reflection, and she studied the face staring back. Her hair, still thick but streaked with gray, framed a visage etched with lines of experience. She had aged gracefully, or so people told her, but the gap between her appearance and Sam's vitality felt insurmountable. What would people think? The question, unspoken until now, weighed heavily. She imagined the looks of pity or judgment, the whispers behind cupped hands. And Sam? What would he think? She had no reason to believe he saw her as anything more than a friend. Perhaps she was a comforting presence, a stand-in for the family he had left behind. The possibility that he might pity her, lonely, older Evelyn, cut deep. And yet, despite her rationalizations, the feelings refused to be silenced. They clung to her, stubborn and relentless, like the scent of lilacs after a spring rain. The next morning, Evelyn resolved to approach their interactions with caution. She would guard her emotions, keeping them hidden in a corner of her heart where they couldn't cause harm. But as the week unfolded, she found the task impossible. Sam's warmth, his kindness, and the ease with which he engaged her in conversations about everything from books to his failed attempts at baking, it all chipped away at her resolve. One afternoon, as they stood outside the store after another serendipitous meeting, he asked, "Do you ever feel like life can surprise you in the best ways when you least expect it?" His question caught her off guard, but she nodded. "Yes, I suppose it can." "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, smiling thoughtfully. I don't know. I guess meeting you has felt like that. Like one of those good surprises. The words were casual, almost offhand, but they lingered in the air, heavier than they seemed. Evelyn felt her breath catch, her carefully maintained boundaries trembling under the weight of his sincerity. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't deny it anymore. She had fallen for him. And the realization, though terrifying, carried with it a sweetness she hadn't felt in years. Evelyn found herself walking a precarious tightrope between elation and unease. Her days were no longer filled with just errands and solitude. They were colored by the anticipation of seeing Sam, of hearing his laugh, or catching the way his eyes lit up during their conversations. Yet, with every moment of joy came the relentless pull of doubt. What am I doing? She thought, staring at the untouched crossword puzzle in front of her one evening. The silence of her house, once a comfort, now felt oppressive, amplifying her inner turmoil. The age difference loomed in her thoughts like an unyielding shadow. Every societal norm she had adhered to whispered warnings. He's too young. People will talk. It's not fair to him. But then there was the other voice, quieter yet resolute, asking, what if this is real? Evelyn tried to reason with herself. She told herself it was just a fleeting infatuation, the kind born of loneliness and the novelty of someone paying attention to her. Yet, even in the privacy of her mind, the excuse felt hollow. This wasn't some passing whim. The depth of her feelings scared her as much as they thrilled her. The hardest moments came when she was with him. It was in the way he listened so attentively, his focus never wavering, making her feel seen in a way she hadn't for years. It was in the subtle kindnesses, the way he carried her groceries without being asked or remembered small details about her life. And then there were the moments when his hand would brush hers accidentally, sending a jolt of electricity through her, leaving her flustered and questioning if he had felt it too. Evelyn replayed their interactions over and over, dissecting every word, every glance. Did his lingering looks mean anything? Or was she imagining it all, projecting her feelings onto an innocent friendship? The more she thought about it, the more paralyzed she became. She avoided the grocery store for days, afraid to face him, afraid of the way her heart would betray her the moment she saw him again. But the ache of missing him was unbearable. When she finally did return, it wasn't with a grocery list but with a lump in her throat and a desperate need to see him. She spotted him near the produce aisle, examining a bunch of bananas with an expression of exaggerated seriousness. The sight made her laugh despite herself, a sound that drew his attention. Evelyn! His face broke into a grin, and he waved her over. It's been too long. I was starting to think you'd found another grocery store to haunt. The warmth in his voice unraveled her defenses. No, just busy, she lied, trying to sound nonchalant. Busy, huh? He raised an eyebrow. Too busy to check out the coffee shop we talked about? I waited for your call, you know. His words caught her off guard. Had he really been waiting? The realization that he had missed her made her pulse quicken. She hesitated, searching for an excuse, but the honesty in his eyes disarmed her. I didn't think you'd actually want to go with me. His brow furrowed in confusion. Why wouldn't I? Because I'm 53, she thought. Because I'm old enough to be your mother. Because I'm terrified of what this could mean. But instead, she shrugged and said, I guess I didn't want to bother you. You could never bother me, he said softly, his tone carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. The conversation shifted after that, back to lighter topics, but the air between them felt different, charged with unspoken truths. That night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep pretending her feelings didn't exist. But what could she do? The thought of acting on them felt reckless, yet the idea of letting him slip away was unbearable. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had long since dismissed, that perhaps love, unpredictable and defiant, wasn't bound by time or rules. Evelyn spent the next week oscillating between exhilaration and anxiety. Every time she saw Sam at the grocery store, their conversations felt warmer, more meaningful. He had started sharing little pieces of his life with her, his job as a freelance photographer, his love for hiking, his habit of collecting vinyl records. And each detail painted a fuller picture of who he was, vibrant, thoughtful, and utterly captivating. She began to wonder if he saw her as more than just a friendly acquaintance. His compliments, though casual, often felt intentional. "You have such an eye for colors," he'd said when she picked out flowers for her garden. Or, "You always make the simplest things sound fascinating," after she had described a rainy morning spent baking scones. But doubt lingered like a shadow. Could she really be misreading his kindness for something deeper? Or worse, was she projecting her own feelings onto him, clinging to a hope that wasn't there? One evening, after their usual banter near the bakery section, Sam had mentioned that he'd been curious about her garden. "You talk about it all the time. It sounds amazing," he'd said, leaning casually against the cart. "Maybe someday you'll see it," she had replied, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. Now that someday loomed in front of her, Evelyn spent hours pacing her living room, questioning her decision. Was it too forward to invite him over? What would he think? What would people think? And yet, the thought of sharing something so personal, her garden, her sanctuary, with him felt right. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was an opportunity to step out of the cocoon she had wrapped herself in for years. She made her decision on a whim, scribbling her number and address on the back of an old receipt. The next time she saw him at the store, she slipped it into his hand as they parted ways. "If you're free this weekend, come by," she said, her voice trembling with equal parts hope and fear. Sam looked at the note, then at her, a smile breaking across his face. "I'd love to." For the rest of the week, Evelyn busied herself preparing her garden and her heart. She pulled weeds, rearranged flower pots, and even bought new cushions for the patio chairs. Every task felt monumental, a distraction from the nervous anticipation that built with each passing day. On Saturday afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, she set the table with tea and a plate of freshly baked cookies. Her reflection in the patio door startled her. There was a glow in her cheeks, a spark in her eyes that had been absent for years. When the doorbell rang, her breath caught in her throat. She smoothed her dress and opened the door to find Sam standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These reminded me of your stories about the garden," he said, his grin as warm as the sunlight behind him. Evelyn took the flowers, her fingers brushing against his. "They're perfect," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As she led him to the patio, Evelyn couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, having him there. The way he marveled at her garden, asking questions and complimenting her work, made her heart swell. "This is incredible," he said, settling into one of the chairs. "It's so peaceful here. I can see why you love it." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Evelyn found herself laughing more than she had in years, her usual self-consciousness dissolving under his easy charm. As the sun set, casting golden hues over the garden, Sam leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Thank you for inviting me. This has been one of the best days I've had in a long time." Evelyn's heart fluttered at his words, but she masked her emotions with a smile. "I'm glad you came." As the evening stretched on, the air between them grew quieter, heavier with unspoken truths. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that this wasn't just a fleeting connection, but something more profound, something worth risking everything for. The week that followed Sam's visit felt like a delicate dream, one that Evelyn couldn't quite shake. Every moment spent in her garden, every quiet morning with her cup of tea, was now tinged with the memory of him. His laughter echoed in her mind, his smile lingered in her thoughts, and, as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, she found herself waiting for the next time she'd see him. It came sooner than she expected. Sam called her on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice warm and easy as always. "I was wondering if you'd like some company tomorrow evening." "I'd love to bring dinner," he said. Dinner. Her heart raced. The casual nature of his invitation made it seem effortless, but Evelyn knew better. This wasn't just a friendly gesture. It was the next step in whatever strange, intoxicating dance they were beginning to share. "Yes, of course," she replied, the words escaping before she could stop them. She felt a flutter in her stomach as she wondered what this evening would bring. That night, as the hours stretched long, Evelyn found herself standing in front of her wardrobe, debating what to wear. Her closet, once filled with clothes chosen for utility rather than style, now seemed to offer nothing but choices that felt too daring, too bold. She finally settled on a soft blue blouse, one that matched her eyes, and a pair of jeans that were both comfortable and flattering. Nothing too much, she thought, but something that felt just right. When Sam arrived, there was something in the way he looked at her, a spark, an understanding, like he saw something in her that no one else had noticed. She felt her breath hitch as he stepped inside, his presence filling the room. He didn't just bring food. He brought an energy that seemed to light up her apartment in a way it hadn't been in years. They sat together at her small dining table, talking about everything and nothing at all. Sam had made a simple pasta dish, but the way he described how he prepared it, the care in every word, made it feel like a feast. They laughed over wine and shared stories about their childhoods, Evelyn's small town, his big city dreams, and somewhere between bites something shifted. Sam reached out, lightly brushing his hand against hers. A spark passed through her, igniting a warmth that made her pulse quicken. She looked up at him, her heart racing. There it was, the moment she had been anticipating, the one she had feared and hoped for all at once. Sam's gaze softened, his fingers lingering on hers. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice thick with something unspoken. "I've been thinking about you a lot." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She pulled her hand back slightly, the weight of the moment settling on her like a heavy blanket. Her mind raced. What did this mean? What did he mean? I've been thinking about you too," she confessed, her voice trembling. There was no use denying it anymore. Her feelings, once carefully guarded, had spilled over into the open. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. "I didn't want to rush this, but I don't think I can ignore how I feel. I want you to know that." Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, but a part of her wanted to resist, wanted to step back and protect herself from the inevitable heartache. But the other part, the part that had been dormant for so long, yearned to leap forward, to surrender to this unexpected, beautiful connection. "I'm scared, Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared of how much this means, of how different it is from what I thought I knew about love." He reached out again, cupping her face gently in his hands. "You don't have to be scared. We don't have to have all the answers right now. But what I know is, I want this. I want us, however it unfolds." A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek, and Sam wiped it away with his thumb. She smiled, her heart full to the brim with emotion she couldn't quite name. She had been so careful for so many years, locking her heart away, building walls to keep out the hurt. But now, in the presence of this man, this younger man, with all his warmth and spontaneity, she could feel those walls starting to crumble. "Me too," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. And as their lips met for the first time, the world seemed to fade away. There was no judgment, no fear of age or expectations. Just two people, drawn together by a connection neither of them could explain, but both of them felt deeply. The kiss was soft at first, a tentative exploration, but it quickly grew more urgent, as if their hearts had been waiting for this moment all along. In that kiss, Evelyn felt something shift inside her, a sense of freedom, of release. She wasn't just the woman she had been for so many years. She was something more, and with Sam, she could finally embrace that. As the days passed, Evelyn found herself reflecting on what had just happened, trying to make sense of the rush of emotions that had overtaken her. She was no stranger to love. She had been married once, many years ago, to a man who had shared her dreams in her bed. But that love, like everything else in her past, felt like something frozen in time, a chapter she had closed long ago. She hadn't expected to feel anything like this again, not in her 50s, not with someone so much younger. She spent the next morning in her favorite spot, sitting on her small balcony with a mug of coffee, watching the early light spill across the city. The warmth of the sun was soothing, but her mind was alive with questions. What did this mean? How would they navigate the world outside her apartment, where people might judge or gossip? Would she be able to shed the weight of her own insecurities about their age difference? When she first met Sam, she had thought of him as a pleasant young man, someone who brought a little brightness to her otherwise ordinary life. But now, he was more than just that. He was a living, breathing reminder that life could still surprise her, that love was not something bound by age, nor by the expectations she had long held onto. Sitting there in the quiet, Evelyn found herself smiling at the thought of him, his energy, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about his passions, his easy laugh that seemed to fill the room. There was a freshness to him, a kind of openness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She had lived most of her life carrying her responsibilities, maintaining her sense of duty, and for the first time in ages, she felt like she was allowed to be a little selfish, to want something just for herself. But then doubt crept in. She had read the stories, heard the whispers, and felt the judging stares when she'd been out with Sam a few times. She had heard the quiet comments, the polite but pointed questions. She had become all too aware of the way people looked at them. A man his age, with his vitality and optimism, should be with someone his own age, shouldn't he? Someone whose life didn't feel so far behind him, whose skin didn't carry the evidence of years lived. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. The world would always have its opinions, wouldn't it? But as she looked out at the city, the same city she had lived in her whole life, she realized that what mattered was how she felt when Sam was with her. When he smiled at her, when he kissed her gently at the door before leaving her apartment. When he said her name with such affection, like it was the sweetest thing he'd ever heard. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was certainly a part of it. It was the way Sam made her feel alive again, how he had awakened something in her she thought she had long outgrown. The way they fit together so naturally, as if all the years that separated them melted away in the heat of their conversations and shared moments. Evelyn had spent so long afraid of being too much or too little, of being judged for her choices, for the years she had lived. But now, for the first time, she didn't feel defined by any of it. Sam didn't look at her and see the decades of life lived. He looked at her and saw the woman she was now. The woman who could laugh with him over dinner, who could share her dreams and her fears without fear of rejection. She wasn't just an older woman anymore. She was a woman in love. She was a woman discovering parts of herself she hadn't known existed. Parts that had been buried under years of caution and hesitation. And so, as the days passed and Sam continued to visit, Evelyn embraced her feelings without apology. There would be challenges ahead, of course. There would be doubts, moments of vulnerability when the world would try to convince her that their love didn't fit. But she knew something now, something she had forgotten in all the years of quiet, lonely routine. Love didn't need to make sense to anyone but the people who felt it. Age didn't matter when hearts were connected. It was a lesson she had learned too late, but one she intended to carry with her for as long as she could. Love, at any age, was still love. It still held the power to heal, to bring joy, and to awaken parts of us that had lain dormant for far too long. She could no longer hide from it, nor did she want to. And so, as she sat there, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, Evelyn smiled. She was ready now, ready to embrace whatever came next, with Sam by her side, knowing that love could be beautiful, no matter the age, no matter the circumstances. And that was all that mattered. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she watched the world unfold in front of her. Life had always been predictable, a quiet rhythm of routines and solitary moments, but now everything felt different. The presence of Sam in her life had opened up a new chapter, one that was not confined by age, societal expectations, or the carefully constructed boundaries she had once imposed upon herself. She thought about the first time they had met in that grocery store, the ordinary, mundane moment that had somehow shifted the course of her life. At the time, it had seemed insignificant, a simple exchange between two strangers. But now, looking back, Evelyn realized that it was the moment her life had begun to change. She had no way of knowing then, but it was as if fate had nudged her into this unexpected, exhilarating, and deeply emotional journey. Sam had brought with him more than just joy. He had reminded her that love was not confined to a certain age or stage of life. It wasn't something you had to chase or wait for. It was something that could find you when you least expected it, even when you were past the time when you thought you could still feel that spark. As she thought about what the future might hold, Evelyn no longer felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. The questions about judgment, the fears about what people might say, all seemed distant now. Because what she had with Sam was hers. It was real. And for the first time in a long time, it was enough. More than enough. She wasn't just an older woman falling for a younger man. She was a woman who had finally recognized that love, in all its forms, had no expiration date. It wasn't something you could outgrow or forget. It was something you could choose, something that could breathe new life into your soul, no matter how many years had passed. Evelyn smiled as she thought about the future. No matter what others might say or think, she would continue to embrace her love for Sam, a love that had defied the boundaries of age, and in doing so, had shown her the extraordinary power of living fully without apology. She would live this love out loud, without fear, without shame. And perhaps, just maybe, others would come to see what she had learned. That love was ageless, timeless, and forever capable of surprising us when we least expect it. The heart was capable of expansion, capable of finding new depths, even when the years seemed stacked against it. In the quiet stillness of her apartment, Evelyn looked out the window again, the sun now fully risen, casting its light over the world. A new day had begun. A new chapter had started, and for the first time in a long time, she felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. Love was possible at any age, and she, at last, was embracing it fully. And for that, she would be eternally grateful.